expected in about 90 days. The felony convictions could land him in prison for the rest of his life. CNN national correspondent Susan Candiotti is live in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania this morning. Susan, good morning to you. We know the verdict, but talk to me a little bit about the reaction after that verdict outside the courtroom.
You know, outside the courthouse, the area where I'm standing was filled with people from this community who had come out here to hear and see what happened, and most of them were cheering. I talked with one woman in the crowd who said, you know, I do not wish things, bad things on people, but Jerry Sandusky did very bad things. And you also had a lot of people out here who are victim advocates, and they see this verdict as not only a vindication for victims of sex abuse, but also an opportunity to encourage others who may also be victims not to feel ashamed and come forward and tell their stories too. Randy?
And what about these three not guilty verdicts? He was convicted on 45 of the 48.
That's right. Quite a commanding decision by the part of this jury. But the three involved one involving an incident that Mike McQuarrie witnessed involving Jerry Sandusky in a shower with a little boy. And while they found the defendant not guilty of one felony count, they did find him guilty of another felony count in that case. And some of the others were also downgraded to a misdemeanor. But I think what this indicates is how carefully this jury went down the list of charges. 48 of them they had to consider, Randy, and very carefully made their decision.
And Matt Sandusky, who is Jerry's youngest adopted son, he also alleged abuse, but he didn't testify, though he said he was willing to. Do you think that still had an impact?
I think it did. You know, publicly until this time, Matt Sandusky, that adopted child, had stood behind his father. But then he came forward and talked to prosecutors and said he wanted to testify for them. And they kept him in their back pocket to use as a rebuttal witness if Jerry Sandusky took the stand. Well, the defense found out that Matt Sandusky was going to be a witness for the prosecution. And so that is a key reason why they didn't put Jerry Sandusky on the stand, though he wanted to tell his side of the story. But that could have been a very devastating follow-up if prosecutors had put his own son on the stand to allege that he too had been abused.
Yeah, certainly more stories of abuse after listening to all of those victims as well. Susan Candiotti, thank you very much. So the question is, what was it like inside the courtroom? Earlier I talked with In Sessions' Jean Casares about what she saw as those verdicts were read.
But I think the emotion that caught me was an empty bench that was in the courtroom until almost the very last minute. And three women sat in that bench, and I didn't recognize them. And then all of a sudden, I looked, and there was victim number 6, who had come and sat in the middle of those women. That is the accuser from 1998, the very first young man that stepped forward because his mother called the school and authorities. He held the hand of his mother, who was the woman that was in the seat before him, so tightly, and he was through the verdict. And when the counsel read, she sobbed in silence, and his eyes just filled with tears. He was the lone victim in that courtroom, we believe, last night, but so emotionally affected.
Part of my conversation there with In Sessions' Jean Casares. We'll have much more on this case and tell you what's ahead for Jerry Sandusky in our next hour. In Philadelphia, prosecutors are calling a verdict there in a child sexual abuse case, quote, historic. For the first time, prosecutors brought charges against church leaders for allegedly covering up abuse by priests. Monsignor William Lynn was found guilty on one charge of child endangerment. His attorney called it a miscarriage of justice. Lynn faces up to 7 years in prison. And to Egypt now, where they are bracing for a historic announcement as thousands of protesters continue to fill Tahrir Square in Cairo. The country's election commission says it will finally announce tomorrow who will be Egypt's first freely elected president. The results of last weekend's presidential runoff were supposed to come out Thursday, but they were delayed, and that's prompted fears of a power grab by Egypt's interim military rulers. Vying for Egypt's top job, an Islamist and ousted leader Hosni Mubarak's final prime minister. In the U.S., General Motors is recalling one of its best-selling small cars. More than 400,000 Chevy Cruzes are being recalled because of a risk of engine fires. The recall covers all of them made in the U.S. between September of 2010 and last month. GM wants to modify an engine shield that could create a fire hazard. George Washington's copy of the Constitution fetched $9.8 million at auction. That's more than 3 times the expected price. Washington wrote notes on the copy. It also comes with a draft of the Bill of Rights. The winning bid came from the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which will put it on display starting next year. Very cool. All right, from the Constitution to a constitutional question. It is the question facing the Supreme Court as they get ready to rule on health care reform and that individual mandate. But what do real people think about the effects of that decision? We'll hear their stories.